and the meeting place is outside on the grass. So food, afternoon tea, morning tea, and lunch will be served outside this room. So to officially kick off, let me introduce the opening keynote today, Jing Jiang from the Australian National University. Jing is a professor at the School of Computing, Engineering and Cybernetics. She was previously a professor and director of the AI and Data Science cluster in the School of Computer and Information Systems at the Singaporean Management University. Her research interests include natural language processing, text mining, and machine learning. She has received 2 Test of Times Award for her work on social media analysis, and she was named Singaporean's 100 Women in Tech in 2021. She holds a PhD degree in computer science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Please help me to welcome Jing.
All right, so good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here to have this opportunity to give a talk. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. All right, so I'm going to talk about LLM evaluation. Of course, no surprise, everyone, almost everyone will be looking at LLMs nowadays. And this is not just us NLP people, but also actually people beyond the NLP community, right? So I'm using this picture just to illustrate, how LLM is really being widely adopted in many areas. Like, for example, back in Singapore, I think in the past couple of years, I've seen my colleagues in other areas, for example, in software engineering, who looked at how you can use LLM not just for code generation, but also for things like analyzing or understanding bugs, bug reports, or the other way around, to use software engineering sort of methodology, right, to test these large language models. And then also people in security will be looking at those, security-related issues like privacy, and let's say prevent jailbreaking. So so there's no surprise that also at ALTA this year, when I looked at these accepted papers, I found that 2/3 of the long papers have LLM in their title, and that's not including 2 more papers that have language modeling or language models in their titles. Right? So obviously we're going to look at large language models. So then the natural question would be, what do we do with large language models nowadays, right? So this was also the main kind of topic of the public lecture yesterday. So for those of you who were here yesterday, I hope many of you, or maybe all of you, attended Professor Hovey's talk. Then you might remember that the main takeaway from his talk is, there's at least these 3 interesting and important directions that we as NLP researchers, should be looking at. So there's, how to make LLMs usable, right? For example, how to make these models smaller, or how to make them run faster, and then how to make LLMs useful in various domains. But let me just, zoom into the last one, which is how to make LLMs understandable, which is also what, Professor Hovey talked a lot about yesterday. So another way to sort of phrase this question is, why do LLMs behave this way, right? So to understand why does it, let's say, have certain level of reasoning capabilities, or why does this hallucinate? And I would kind of argue that, okay, before we ask this why question, let's first ask the what question, right? So what are LLMs' behaviors? Right, so we need to first know, okay, what are the behaviors before we start asking why do they behave this way? And there's also, a wide range of behaviors that we can look at. So that would include not only the traditional kind of capabilities or behaviors we expect intelligent systems to have, such as, to answer questions accurately or to follow instructions nowadays, or even to understand humor, right? But also things that maybe we don't really expect humans to do well, like, to not to have bias or stereotypes. I mean, of course, ideally, we don't want to have those for humans, but we also know that, the reason there are biases and stereotypes is exactly because we as humans, right, tend to have these. So how do LLMs do in terms of these, in these aspects? So now some of you may kind of wonder, okay, isn't this thing about evaluation something we have been doing all the way, right? So even before LLM, even just for traditional LLM systems, we do evaluation. So I would argue that the importance to understand LLM's behaviors is that they're not just NLP systems. They're not being used, right, by a lot of just ordinary people in various different settings and for a lot of things, not just language understanding or language generation, but reasoning, planning, right? People are really literally using it for everything they can imagine. So now if you take a look at how LLM evaluation has evolved over the years, right? So back in 2019, we had this GLUE benchmark released. And back then, people are looking at these very kind of fundamental traditional NLP tasks, and they're only natural language understanding tasks, not even generation tasks, right? So things like sentiment classification, and then measuring the similarity between sentences or textual entailment. So all these are important tasks. But then very soon, people realize that that's not enough because the capabilities of language models have increased so much, right? So there are all these emerging capabilities of large language models. So then we have Big Bench, which contain 200 over 200 tasks. And if you look at the author list, right, basically, it's a long list. I can't even finish it. Yeah, so then people looked beyond traditional NLP. They look at things like logic, math, code, but also things like causal reasoning, common sense reasoning, which is about understanding the world, and also understanding humans, like this idea of serial mind, right? So where the language models actually can model the state of mind of the other side so that they can sort of make better predictions of the person they are talking to, and then maybe communicate better, right? And then also pro-social behaviors, like whether they have bias or they are biased against certain group of people and so on. So there's a long list, I've not listed out everything in this big bench. And then that's still not enough. So people thought that, okay, if all these benchmark data sets are already released, then there's this data leakage problem, and large language models being what they are, right? They can easily kind of remember these test cases. So then there's this kind of new way of evaluating them. This is a chatbot arena where if you look at how it works, you'll see that people can just go ask any question to two anonymous LLMs, and then you can pick your choice, right? Which one gives you the better response? So by doing this, these models cannot cheat. They don't have any kind of past questions to train on. They don't know what to expect from the actual evaluators. So if you look at sort of the trend, I'll say that evaluation has gone from simple tasks to more complex tasks for sure, but also gone from, I think, objective tasks where we kind of expect, humans with certain level of intelligence would all kind of have answers, right, converge to something. But we have moved to more subjective tasks where we know that even humans will, answer these questions or behave differently. So I'll say here we have moved from assessing LLM's abilities to understanding their behaviors. So an analogy you can think of is, instead of testing a person's IQ, now you're doing a personality test, right? So you just look at, how this person behave, and there's no right or wrong answers there. So I think that's what, a lot of the work nowadays in terms of, looking at LLMs behaviors is what they're doing. So just to give you some examples. So this is a paper from ICWSM this year. And these authors are looking at the persuasive power of large language models, right? So if you look at, the research questions they raised, they're asking, can LLMs emulate realistic dynamics of persuasion and opinion change? Can they generate arguments using various persuasion strategies? Right, so they actually followed some previous studies from social science or psychology where people have studied, what are some effective persuasion strategies that humans use, right? So for example, humans may tend to include factual knowledge to kind of strengthen your arguments, or you may assert a certain level of authority to, make yourself more believable. So then they actually instructed LLMs to kind of, make use of these persuasion strategies. And then they kind of looked at, okay, can LLMs follow those instructions to actually generate arguments using these strategies, and afterwards, whether these arguments generated by LLMs are really convincing. And here's their main conclusion. Simulating human opinion dynamics is within the capabilities of LLMs, and that artificial agents have the potential of playing an important role in collective processes of opinion formation in online social media. So of course, this could be seen in a positive way, but also, we can see there's a lot of danger and a risk there. So by understanding LLM's behaviors, at least, right, we know what might be the potential risks so that we can work towards some solutions, hopefully. And then here's another interesting example I've seen. I think this is, if I'm not wrong, I think New Rips this year. So these people looked at LLM's trust behavior, right? So if you look at the left-hand side and look at the prompt, in particular the one in the middle, then you'll see what they're doing. So they're playing this game sort of with LLM. You're taking part in an experiment. You're randomly paired online with another player. You don't know who the player is, and the player doesn't know who you are. You will receive $10 from the study group. You can give N dollars to the other player, and the player will receive 3 times N dollars, and then can choose how much to return to you. Right? So, how much would you pay in this game? Would you give, $10 so that as a team, you and the other player would receive, $30, and then hopefully the other player will share that with you, right? Or do you, if you don't trust the other player, then that player may just take all the money away and not sharing anything with you. So, so people have studied this with humans, and now these researchers are looking at how LLMs handle this, right? So now if you're interested in the results, you can go read the paper. I think from what I remember, they found that LLMs sort of have seems to have a larger tendency to trust than humans, but I might be wrong. So go check out the paper yourself. All right, so yeah, so hopefully what I have been trying to do is to sort of convince you that there are a lot of interesting things in terms of understanding LLM's behaviors, and I think there's also a lot of applications in the sense that once we understand their behavior, then we can design better systems using LLMs or prevent, misuse of LLMs. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to share some recent work that I've done with my students and collaborators. And these are just, a small, tiny subset of the wide range of things people are doing right now in terms of, understanding LLMs. I just hope that, by sharing with you some of the work we have done, you maybe find it interesting, and then maybe, get some inspiration for your future work. So, so first, let's look at this role-playing LLMs. I'm sure you know this is not new to you. Oftentimes, when you prompt an LLM to do something, you'll start with things like act as a maybe a programmer, right, or pretend you are a lawyer, right? And in fact, yesterday during Ed's talk, you may remember that people actually found that, right, this kind of prompts are more effective than saying things like, please do this, please do that, right? And role-playing LLMs are also kind of gaining a lot of attention. We know that there's a lot of work on multi-agent systems. People may use LLMs to simulate different roles, and these different agents will collaborate with each other, right, to perform a task. Like, for example, when you do software development, you may need an agent playing the role of a user, right, to specify the requirements. And then on the other side, you may have, programmers, but also maybe managers managing the project. And people also have tried to use this kind of multi-agent system as a way to understanding human behaviors in the society, based on the assumption that these LLMs can really, right, simulate the roles of different groups of people. Then naturally the question will be, can LLMs really do role-playing? Right. So in terms of evaluating the role-playing behaviors of LLMs, so when we did our work, I think last year, so we found that, okay, the previous work looked at certain things about role-playing, but not all. So for example, they may ask some questions to this role-playing LLM about the character that the role-playing LLM is trying to simulate, right? So about that character's experience. So if you ask LLM to kind of pretend to be Harry Potter, then, okay, does it remember certain things that happened to Harry Potter? Right, or certain knowledge that only that particular role would know, or that particular role should know, right? So if you are a doctor versus you are a lawyer, right, probably, the kind of knowledge you have will be different. And then people also looked at passing, using a Turing test to kind of judge these role-playing LLMs. So there are two pieces of work I'm going to share. One is about writing styles. So we looked at how the writing styles of persona-assigned LLMs, are they similar to real humans' writing styles? Are they different? If they're different, how are they different? Right. And then we also looked at how to judge the consistency of a role-playing LLM. So if the LLM is talking a conversation, so across the different turns of the conversation, can we, just by looking at the utterance of the role-playing LLM, can we kind of recognize, oh, it's the same person kind of talking? Okay, so let me give a bit more detail. So, okay, so for this writing style analysis, basically we want to ask this question, right? So how can we characterize the writing style similarities and differences? Because, okay, if we're going to look at, in terms of writing style, whether the LLM, role-playing LLM is writing in the, let's say, simple, very simple, straightforward style, or maybe very rude, in a rude way, or maybe very cheerful way. So how can we characterize, right, these writing styles? We want something that's interpretable by humans. We don't want just a vector representing the writing style in a way that nobody can interpret. And then once we have a way of characterizing the writing styles and comparing them, then we can judge or look at, whether a persona assigned LLM can write in the style similar to humans. And we also want to look at different LLMs and to see whether they write in generally speaking, different styles. So obviously, if you think about the approach, there's nothing surprising here. So we basically want to compare human written text with LLM generated text. And here, in order to characterize style, so we make use of a recent model called Lisa that provides interpretable style embeddings. Okay, so I'll talk a bit more about that soon. Okay, so first, what are the personas we we try to use. So there are no specific reasons why we just chose these categories. I think probably just for convenience, and then based on our interests, we categorize these personas into these groups by age, by the location where these people are from, by their profession, and then by their political affiliation. And it's also because we found that it's possible to find some subreddits where, by just looking at the title of the subreddits, you kind of can you kind of can see that, okay, those users in these subreddits belong to these groups. But of course, there's no guarantee. We understand that the limitations of this kind of studies. Yeah, so as you can see, for human written text, we use posts from subreddits. And then for LLM generated text, so we basically prompt LLM. But in order to make sure that the comparison is fair, we want that the topics being discussed in these posts to be similar or the same as the human generated text. So we will reuse those topics that we extracted from subreddit, right? And then ask LLMs to write something about the same topic. And then we basically just ask LLM, okay, take the role of a person from New York City, for example. So that's based on location, but you can replace that with things like, take the role of a person born in 1960s, for example. Yeah, then we ask LLM, we'll give LLM the title, and then LLM will generate the text body. Okay, so how do we characterize the styles? So this is an existing model, a recent model developed by other researchers that we borrowed. So a good thing about this model is that, one is that I think these descriptions of writing styles are derived from Reddit posts as well. Yeah, because I think when these researchers wanted to study writing styles, they realized that, if you want to see a wide range of writing styles, social media is a good platform. So they also went to Reddit to collect data. And then guess what? When you look at these descriptions, they make sense. Like, for example, the author uses uncommon phrases, the author uses descriptive words, but there's really a long list of subscriptors. And who do you guess, came up with these descriptions? Guess? Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So they actually used ChatGPT to generate these descriptions. But then they did a bit of cleaning. So in the end, I think they actually had 700 over descriptions. But for us, we just took, so we used their model, the pre-trained model, to derive this 700 plus dimensional vector, which is not a distribution. It's actually for each dimension, you have a score between 0 and 1, indicating whether the style can be found in that piece of text. So we just picked the top 20 styles, in the sense that, those dimensions that have the highest number or score. So basically, for each piece of text, it will be turned into 20 kind of descriptions. But still, it's hard to interpret these styles using 700 plus dimensions. So, and we also observed that there are many similar and overlapping descriptors. So what we did was to use this, LDA model that maybe some of you have used this, some of you are familiar with it. I'm certainly familiar with it because I used it a long time ago. So we use this LDA model to basically, in a way, to cluster these style descriptors, although it's not like hard clustering. So you actually get these clusters of styles where each cluster is a distribution over different style descriptors. So we used that, and then we played with different numbers of clusters. And in the end, we, by just our, both I think our manual inspection and then some other also objective criteria, then we decided to use these 7 coarse-grained styles. And again, we used ChatGPT to help us to summarize those style descriptors into something that we think are understandable. So you can see here, the 7 styles are inquiry, judgmental, cheerful, professional, unenthusiastic, direct, and analytical. We don't have really good guarantee that these are exactly, the best labels to kind of label those style clusters, but I think just based on what you see here, somehow it makes sense because they really each one is a distinct kind of style. Okay, so now we have these style clusters, which you can see on the right-hand side, top at the top, right? So basically, for real user written text, this is how we derive these style clusters. Then we can use that to also represent LLM generated text in the same way. So this allows us to derive a 7-dimensional distribution over these 7, coarse-grained styles for each piece of text. So here, just to give you a sense of, what we observed in terms of human written text. So we found that for some of these demographic groups, we do observe some clear differences in terms of writing style, right? So over here, you can see that for this purple one, which are millennials, they, just based on our observation or our data analysis, they're more judgmental, but Gen Z are more direct. So it sort of makes sense, but of course, again, we acknowledge that there are always, limitations with this kind of studies because we kind of assume that, right, the posts we got from these subreddits are indeed written by people from those groups. But anyway, I think the interesting thing here is that we do observe some differences. But then for some, I think categories of demographic groups, I think, for example, the political affiliation, I think the differences are not so obvious. Okay, so remember that we want to compare human written text and then LLM generated text. So to kind of quantify the style differences, we can use KL divergence. This is one choice. So this is what we adopted. And here's some results. So it's actually not very easy to, I think, to have very clear conclusions from looking at all these numbers. And part of the reason is that, as you can see, for example, if we look at llama and the KL divergence basically shows, how llama, when you ask it to generate some text to represent Gen Z, how its style distribution differs from the Reddit, right, distribution. So it seems to be low, but then if you move on to a different group, it's not consistently always low, it may change, right? The same with some other models, right, Mistral. So it's high for Gen Z and then, low for millennial. So, okay, so yeah, so I won't bore you with all these results that we observed, but I will just tell you about, what we think can be the observations or kind of conclusions we can draw. So first of all, we find that LLMs do write in different styles when you tell them to take up different kind of personas. So they will have different writing styles, at least being as being characterized by this Lisa model or our coarse-grained style clusters. But we can't really conclude that their style distributions are similar to what we found in human written posts, right? So we can't really conclude that. Sometimes they seem to be similar to some groups, but sometimes not. But we do find that different LLMs themselves have their own kind of style characteristics. So we feel, based on our observation, we feel that llama seems to be more informal, Mistral seems to be more formal, and therefore they tend to deviate from Reddit in general, because Reddit is a social media platform. People tend to write in a more informal way, and then GPT is somewhere in between. So I would say the study, I think, gives us some idea about LLM's writing styles, and maybe give us some idea of, when you expect LLM to be able to role play, at least to, role play in these demographic groups, you might want to think about, do I care about their writing style, is it important to make sure that they write in a style that's similar to that group of people? If that part is important to you, then you might need to do some evaluation before you start using this kind of role-playing LLMs. Okay, so the second piece of work I'm going to share is about speaker verification. Okay, so it's still about role-playing LLMs, but here we're looking at, an LLM carrying out a conversation with another person, could be another LLM agent. But I think what we care about is it talking in a way that's consistent, so people can see that, okay, I'm talking to the same person throughout the whole conversation. Now, in order to judge this, you will need, a way to, all right, you normally you probably ask a human to judge, okay, can you see the consistency across different, the various turns of the conversation? But that would be too labor intensive, right? So we want to have an automatic system to kind of verify the speaker's identity. So that's sort of partially the goal of the study, to develop so-called speaker verification model, and then use this model to kind of compare those different role-playing LLMs. And the reason we found that we need to develop this model is because when we try to do directly using LLMs themselves to do speaker verification, we found the performance not to be very good. Right? So then we turn to supervised learning-based approach. We try to use different models or features to represent the utterances, and then basically see whether we have a model that can judge between a pair of utterances, are these from the same speaker or not the same speaker? So if it's a positive pair, then basically we think that, okay, these two utterances are indeed from the same speaker. If not, then it's a negative pair. And then finally, after we train such a model, we used this to verify, to actually evaluate different existing role-playing LLMs. So I'll say a bit more about that later. So what are our main findings? So again, we find that this is not so straightforward. So maybe I should first, this is the findings from, the evaluation of role-playing LLMs. But before that, maybe I'll just say a bit about the speaker verification model. So maybe let me go back here, right? So remember, we first tried to train the speaker verification model. So we find that it's not easy to get such a model with high accuracy, especially if you train on certain kind of characters rows, but then you test on unseen characters, unseen rows. So it's actually not easy. So again, I think the findings for this comparison of different role-playing LLMs should. Again, I think we may want to just trust those very obvious findings or patterns and then not go into the details, because the speaker verification model, I think, work only to some extent. Right? So what we found, what we can kind of confidently conclude from our findings is that when we looked at several different ways of doing role playing. So either you use a system prompt to ask this large language model to play a certain role, or there are existing LLMs people have developed that are already doing role playing, like this character LLM, character.ai. So they have some already models that's supposed to do role playing. So when we look at these models' abilities to simulate certain roles, and in particular, I think we looked at those well-known characters like, characters from popular sitcoms, or movies, right, like Harry Potter or Friends. So we looked at those characters and ask these models to simulate those characters. So one thing we found is that they don't really preserve personal characteristics in the generated utterances. So So in a way, like, if you really want them to do role playing, then people may not really see that, oh, these different utterances are really from the same role. Or, when you look at utterance generated by LLM trying to play the role of, let's say, Harry Potter, or maybe Sheldon in the Big Bang Theory, right? So you may or may not be able to guess who that character is. But on the other hand, we also find that different role-playing models may have their built-in characteristics that persist when playing different roles. So different models, when they are trained, they may already have some biased kind of characteristics in them. So this is a bit similar to what I shared earlier about the writing styles of different large language models. Remember, like Llama tends to be more informal, and then Mistral are more formal. So it's a bit like that. Okay, so now let me turn to this part, which is about evaluation of multimodal LLMs. Okay, so we are going beyond just text. Now we're looking at text plus images. Why is this important? So as you can see, there are different kinds of multimodal LLMs developed. These are actually already considered old models. I reused some old slides. So the left-hand one is the CLIP model that maybe some of you have used, right? So it's trained on text and image pairs, and then eventually it's supposed to be able to project an image and the text that have the same semantic meaning into the same space, so they will be similar in terms of their representation. But then there are also other models, more powerful models, that allow you to use language in the form of instructions together with a piece of image. And of course, nowadays with ChatGPT models having this capability, so this is something that everyone is already familiar with. And in terms of application, like in addition to just asking ChatGPT to analyze the image or analyze the graph, you can also imagine, right, embodied AI, where the AI system really is working in the wild with observing the surroundings, using its visual understanding capabilities together with language understanding capabilities. And in the future, there might be, opportunities for humans and AI to team up to solve problems, right? Then you need these multimodal understanding capabilities. Okay, so again, we want to evaluate these multimodal LLMs capabilities. The obvious ones would be, can they detect objects? If I ask the model, right, do you see, how many people do you see in this picture, right? So can they detect, can they count, or can they detect attributes? What color is the shirt that this boy is wearing, right, in the picture? Or can they describe the pictures? So those are obvious ones. And then visual question answering kind of cover all of this, and then going beyond that, right? There will be maybe reasoning needed to answer a question, or common sense knowledge needed to answer a question. So we looked at something a bit different. So we want to see when the image is presenting something a bit uncommon, then can the model still understand the image and then answer the question correctly? So so the first one we looked at is when when the image may not reflect kind of a stereotypical scenario. And probably many people have seen this example, because this, I think, was also in the CLIP paper published, right? So this is a picture of a female astronaut. But if you present these two captions to this CLIP model, or maybe many early days multimodal large language models, you ask, which caption is more likely to best describe the picture. So many models may, actually prefer the second one. And obviously there is, right, there's some gender bias there, because female, right, housewife, smiling. So there are certain, we can see that these words have high correlation in the training corpus, and therefore somehow the model, right, will pick up that. So, and if you look at the right-hand side, so these are some This is actually from a data set developed by other researchers to study stereotypes, but in language models only. So they will raise this question, my sister is, and then they ask a language model to pick the next word, right? So then they see whether the language model is going to say, my sister is caring, or my sister is rude, or some meaningless word, just to check the language model's own language modeling capability. So we looked at this data set, and then we thought that, oh, maybe we can extend this to multimodal setting where the picture actually is showing the anti-stereotypical setting, or the uncommon, maybe if you name it that way, the scenario, right? So what we did was we created this data set called vision language stereo set. So the original data set is called stereo set, stereotypical set. So we extended it to vision language setting. And this data set looked at stereotypes in 4 dimensions: gender, race, profession, religion. And what we did was we will pick a description that is sort of non-stereotypical, like my sister is rude, okay, or the chess player is Hispanic. So these are what's considered, non-stereotypical scenario in the original stereo set data set. So we pick these descriptions, and then we go to Google to look for images that represent these kind of scenarios. And of course, we will need humans to judge. So we use mechanical Turks to judge those images. And then eventually we constructed a data set. Not too big, a few hundred images, I think. But still, I think it serves a purpose. So let me go back to just, so the findings, right? So we actually find that back then when we tested this models back then in 2022 against this data set, we found that the vision language models back then, I think Clip, Blips, there's some older models, they did show clear presence of stereotypical kind of bias in them. And then we also found that those stereotypes related to gender are more pronounced. Okay, and let's now move on to talk about another piece of work we did more recently. So this was from last year. So here, there's some similarity here in the sense that we are also looking at images that are kind of different from what you commonly found, right? So it's kind of uncommon images, but they are not against stereotypes. They're just less likely to be found in real world. So this is a picture of a fish actually outside of fishbowl. So if you ask a human, is the fish inside the fishbowl or outside the fishbowl, a human definitely can recognize it. And obviously you would expect with these vision language models to be able to do this, right? But surprisingly, you'll see that many of them actually cannot do this well because their common sense knowledge that fish is oftentimes right inside the fishbowl will just overtake their visual perception capabilities. Right. So so for this, we looked at 5 types of visual common sense knowledge. So about objects. So their color, right? What are the common colors of different objects? What are their shapes, materials, the size, relative size, actually, like so for example, in one of our example, pizza should be smaller than a chair, but we have an example with a bigger chair, a chair much bigger than pizza, and also positional relations, right? So like a laptop should be on top of a table rather than under a table, things like that. So now this kind of images will be hard to be found on the internet. So we went to these generative AI models, DALL-E 2 in this case, to generate these images. And then we also judged the quality of the images because it actually turned out to be very difficult to generate these uncommon images. Yeah, so we really have to manually kind of filter out the unqualified one and then just keep the ones that are good enough for this experiment. And so here are some examples or results. And Yeah, not really examples, but the main results. So we found that so these models actually can recognize objects, right? So if you ask, is there a fish in this image, or is there a fishbowl in this image, it will not make many mistakes. So the object detection performance is above 90%. But then if you ask these questions, is the fish inside the fishbowl? Is the fish outside the fishbowl? So we ask the same question twice, but in different ways, right? Because we hope to see, the model to be consistent. Because if, the model answer yes to both questions, it doesn't mean anything. So we have to, ask it in this way. And then we found that, these models that we looked at actually didn't do well. So the best is this model called Instruct Blip. Right, so it performed the best, but even for that model, its performance is 63% or 64%. And we also asked this other question. So okay, so if you common sense knowledge is kind of strong, right? Then can you just answer some question about just common sense? So in general, is a fish inside a fishbowl or not? And then but then we have two settings. In one setting, we give it a blank image, a completely white image or black image. And then in the other setting, we give this counterintuitive image. And so we found that also they don't answer the question always very well. And then actually a big reason for that is they don't consistently answer this pair of questions. They also often have inconsistent answers, and then those will be counted as wrong answer, right? So it turns out that still they cannot do well. But what's even worse is that if you give a counterintuitive image instead of a blank image, then the model will be affected. It will be more likely to answer the question wrongly. So still, it does pay attention to the image. So it can't really sort of tell that, is the question related to the image, or is the question just asking a, general question? Because in this case, we added this keyword in general, right? Okay, so basically, I've shared with you a few recent pieces of work that we have done along the line of understanding LLM's behaviors. So in the beginning, I tried to kind of explain why I believe it's important to understand LLM's behaviors, and I share some, I think, also interesting work from others, like looking at LLM's persuasive power, looking at LLM's trust behavior. And then I shared some of our own work in terms of evaluating role-playing LLMs, in terms of their writing style, in terms of whether they are consistent across different utterances in the conversation. And I also share some work about evaluating multimodal LLMs in terms of social bias and in terms of common sense understanding, but also overcoming their common sense knowledge to handle those counterintuitive scenarios. And if you remember, that all the findings, conclusions we drew, it seems that oftentimes LLMs are still not as good as we expected, right? So they have these behaviors, but some of this is about, we have certain level of expectation of their behavior. And some of this is, we know that they may behave differently, but we still hope, like for example, the role-playing LLM, we know that when we ask them to assume the role of different people, they should behave differently. But do they really behave in a way similar to real people of that with that persona? So that is a question, and then we found that still there's a gap there. So what might be some, interesting directions to look at in the future? So personally, I'm still interested in looking at, in general, interesting scenarios or interesting tasks, right? So one piece of work we are working on now is to see whether multimodal large language models can use visual input to disambiguate a sentence. So for example, if you see this sentence, the man and the woman held a clock. So is there just a single clock, or are there two clocks? right? So this is a very, I think, classic kind of ambiguous sentence or underspecified sentence, because we don't know, right, whether the sentence should be read as, both the man and the woman the man and the woman are holding the same clock, or they each, right, is holding a clock. So ideally, if you see this image, then you have no problem with the disambiguation, right? But surprisingly, again, in our study so far, the experiments we've done so far, still we don't see consistent answers by these latest LLMs. I think not ChatGPT, but then the open source latest multimodal LLMs. But even ChatGPT, I think, with in our preliminary findings, we find that also they cannot always disambiguate these scenarios correctly. So that's one example. And then there are some other, topics I'm interested in. So for example, climate change is a big, topic nowadays. And if people are relying on LLMs, to understand various scientific topics, naturally, they will turn to LLM, right, to ask about climate change. But will LLM give you the right answer to those factual questions? And then there are also a lot of debatable questions related to climate change. As we all know, it's still a topic that doesn't that have different draw different opinions, or people have different different maybe different stakeholders will think differently about what we need to do in terms of climate change. Then if you turn to LLM to discuss this topic, what kind of stance, right, does LLM take? And there are also, things like, do LLMs understand different cultures? Will they behave according to the cultural norms in certain setting? First of all, maybe, do we expect them to behave according to cultural norms? And then can they do that, right? And also there's also a lot of, I think, recent interests in terms of the moral values of LLMs, right? So there's, I think, a wide range of interesting directions people can look at. And I also want to point out that how to do this evaluation itself is not trivial. So I mentioned earlier that, we had to come up with two questions, but two binary questions, right? Asking the same thing two different ways to make sure that these models are answering these questions consistently, right? Is the fish inside the bowl? Is the fish outside the bowl? So this is actually, I think, a common challenge faced by people. So, in, I think, some recent papers trying to understand LLM's political bias, right? So you ask these questions about your political leaning to LLM. So they found that if you raise the question as a binary question, or maybe a multiple choice question, you draw a certain conclusion. But if you ask the question in an open-ended manner, then you may draw different conclusions. So we actually don't yet have a good way of, writing the correct prompts, or maybe I shouldn't use the word correct, but what's the best prompts we should use in order to understand their behavior. And I think a related question is, if LLMs behave differently just because you phrase the same question differently, then what does it mean? Right? So I think all these are very important questions to answer. And then, of course, finally, there's the why question that goes back to yesterday's talk by Ed, right? So after you understand the behaviors of LLMs, then naturally you ask, why do they behave this way? So that, if you want to sort of improve their behaviors, or if you want to develop new capabilities, then you have some idea about how to, make these changes. All right, so I think with that, I will just finish up here. And I also noticed that in ALTA's program, there are several papers looking at can LLM do this, right? Do they do that? So they are also understanding LLM's different behaviors. For example, the first paper here, do they generate creative and visually accessible data visualization, right? So I encourage you to check out those papers. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Shane, for a very interesting talk. This is time for questions. We have time for 2 questions, please.
Hello, thank you for this talk. I find it very interesting. The thing I want to ask is, throughout all of your research, you basically demonstrated that large language models, they have this kind of internal inertia, and it carries all of these inertia into the downstream tasks that they perform. One of the things is based on the submissions from the papers this year, and also based on what most of the people are doing right now, they're taking these kind of small-sized large language models off the shelf and then doing some extra stuff on top of it. So are there any intermediate steps that we can do in order to ensure that it becomes less biased as possible? So are there anything that we should do before we actually carry out the downstream task, based on your opinion?
Yeah, thanks for the great question. Yeah, so I think when we were carrying out this line of work, I think I always kind of ask my students, right? So after we find these maybe limitations or problematic behaviors, what's the next step, right? How can we guide the fine-tuning of these models, or even maybe the way to deploy these models? Can we fix the problem? But I have to admit that I probably don't have, the knowledge about the latest techniques that people are using, right, to look at these things. So I've looked at some sort of directions or techniques. So for a while, I think we were looking at those control generation. So basically, can you manipulate the probability of the next token prediction, right? For next token prediction. So if you know that by generating the next token, you're going to generate a biased sentence, then can we stop it from there? So can we detect it first, right? And then can we maybe inject a different distribution so that we will still maybe generate a word or maybe a few words that are semantically still similar to what we would like to generate, but then in terms of whether it contains bias or whether it contains some whether it's in toxic language, right? So can we remove that? So there's I think some techniques along the line of this kind of controlled generation. And that's not, I think, by changing the parameters of the large language models themselves. And then, then I would say, I think also a lot maybe has to be done in terms of what do we believe, as a group or as a society ourselves, what should be the expected behavior? Because especially, when I talked about cultural norms, so different societies, right, different nations, different peoples will have different values and different cultural norms. So you can't really impose, right, one to the same, to the other. Yeah, I think people have actually already generally found that LLMs, with the training data, with the data they are trained on, they already sort of are they're closer to certain type of people, right? So I think if you have read the recent literature, you know that they're probably representing the well-educated people better than, right, the rest, or the certain values better than other values. So, but then that might not be what we want. So even just, I think, to have a consensus of what kind of values we want these LMs to have, I think but that's not a question that I think, only that can be solved by just NLP researchers. So we have to work with, I think, people outside of our field.
It's a bit annoying because the mics are not very good. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Hey, it should work. Thank you for your talk. Just a quick question going back to writing styles. You talked about demographics and Gen X, and Jen said, in a nefarious way, do you see that perhaps being used to target particular groups with misinformation? And also not just demographics, but even personality types. Are you aware of any work along in that way?
So yeah, we are kind of Yeah, we are kind of also starting to look into this. So the reason I shared this particular work about persuasive power, right, is because currently I'm quite interested in looking at, if people want to use LLMs to as agent to persuade other people, right? So are they going to even without prompting, are they going to exploit certain strategies, or maybe even using some certain ways of framing a right event or framing an issue to just convince people? And then also whether they are going to do this based on their knowledge about who they are talking to. Although we haven't, started any work along this line, but these are some interesting directions I think, can be that we can look into. I think people have studied whether LLMs will kind of generate text differently based on who they are talking to, but then maybe not in the context of trying to convince those people. So I'm not so sure. I think I have noticed some work, trying to see whether they will behave differently. But I think that's certainly, very important direction to look into.
Thank you, Jane.